Welcome to this explainer. Today we're diving deep into the actual science of addiction, and I guarantee this is going to completely shift how you view this global issue. We're talking about something that affects hundreds of millions of people worldwide. And yet, for the vast majority of human history, society has understood it entirely backwards. So how do we get it so wrong? Well, today we are stripping away the sensationalism. We're going to look strictly at the medical reality and just let the science speak for itself.
Here is our roadmap for today. First, we'll tackle the addiction myth. Then we'll look at the reward system, followed by vulnerability factors, why treatment actually works, and finally, the reality of recovery. Let's get right into it.
Section 1. The addiction myth, a historical mistake.
To really grasp this, we first have to acknowledge a monumental historical mistake. For decades, society essentially labeled addiction as just a weakness. We called it a moral failure, or simply a terrible choice that bad people made. We literally built entire systems of punishment around that false belief. And guess what? Those systems absolutely failed because the core belief was entirely flawed from the start. We need to make a fundamental shift right now. Addiction is a chronic brain disorder. It's a condition shaped by genetics, environment, and neuroscience that physically changes the structure of the brain. It makes stopping extraordinarily difficult. It is not and never was a character flaw. Section 2. The reward system. Brain gets hijacked. Let's move into the neurology to see how this builds into an undeniable medical reality. To understand addiction, you have to understand exactly what it targets. It doesn't just happen randomly anywhere in the brain. It is deeply rooted in what we call the mesolimbic dopamine pathway. This is the absolute epicenter of how addiction takes hold. This specific biological pathway runs straight from the ventral tegmental area to the nucleus accumbens. Now, why does this pathway even exist? Simply put, to keep us alive. When you do something that helps you survive, like eating, for example, this pathway releases dopamine. It creates this really powerful sense of pleasure and motivates you to repeat that exact behavior. It's a brilliant evolutionary mechanism. But addictive substances come in and hijack this exact system with a totally unnatural force. Take cocaine, for example. Cocaine literally blocks dopamine reuptake. This floods the brain's pleasure center with a signal that is many, many times more powerful than any natural reward you could ever experience. And we have to remember, the human brain has never in its entire evolutionary history encountered chemical signals this powerful. It simply isn't built to process them normally. Because of that massive flood, the brain has to physically alter its own structure just to survive. When faced with this unprecedented wave of dopamine, the brain compensates by actually reducing its dopamine receptors. The biological result, the exact same amount of the substance, now produces a much smaller effect. This introduces the fundamental medical concept known as tolerance. Your brain is literally defending itself by turning down the volume on pleasure. And because of those missing, downregulated receptors, being without the drug doesn't just mean you're missing out on a high. The absence of the drug triggers a profoundly painful state called withdrawal. The person feels active, severe discomfort, crushing anxiety, deep depression, intense physical pain, and a truly terrifying inability to feel anything good at all.
We really need to understand that when someone tries to quit, they aren't just making some casual lifestyle choice. They are fighting a brain that has been physically rewired to demand the substance just for its baseline functioning. The decision to stop using is being made by an organ that has altered its very architecture to prioritize the drug above almost everything else. At that point, it is a biological mandate, not a simple lack of willpower.
Section 3. Vulnerability, genetics, and environment. This raises a pretty natural question. If the biological mechanism is universal, why do some people get addicted while others are totally fine? Well, addiction isn't random. The science actually shows us that approximately 40 to 60% of addiction vulnerability is heritable. Certain genetic variations directly affect how your specific reward system reacts to substances. For some, a substance might cause just a mild reaction, but for others with a different genetic makeup, it triggers an overwhelming neurochemical cascade. But of course, genetics alone don't determine outcomes. There's a powerful analogy that perfectly captures the nuance here. The gene loads the gun, the environment pulls the trigger. While genetics play a massive foundational role, people often fall into addiction because they're using substances to manage untreated pain. This could be physical pain, emotional trauma, or psychological distress where they simply don't have adequate alternatives. The environment creates the crisis. The genetics dictate the brain's response.
Section 4. Treatment works, evidence-based care.
Since we know this is a physical condition driven by complex genetics and environmental pain, we have to look objectively at what actually works for treatment. When we look at the data, especially for opioid addiction, the evidence is definitive. Medications like methadone and buprenorphine have incredibly strong scientific backing. They physically reduce cravings, significantly lower the risk of overdose, and actively support long-term recovery. This medication-assisted treatment consistently outperforms abstinence-only approaches. On the flip side, look at what doesn't work: punishment, incarceration, stigma, and shame. The data on their effectiveness is completely abysmal. Measured in terms of reduced addiction and saved lives, they have entirely failed.
Section 5. Recovery Reality, a non-linear process.
This brings us to the really hopeful part of our explainer, getting a realistic, evidence-based understanding of what getting better actually looks like. Recovery is absolutely possible. For many people, it happens every single day. But we have to set the right expectations here. It is rarely a single, clean decision. It's a highly nonlinear process that takes sustained effort, immense support, and time. And crucially, this process very often includes relapses.
We have got to fundamentally change how we view relapse. Relapse isn't evidence of failure. It's a known feature of chronic medical conditions. Think about it like this. People managing diabetes don't consider a bad blood test a moral failure, right? They just adjust their treatment and move forward. The exact same medical framework applies to addiction relapse. It's a signal to adjust the care plan, not a reason for shame. Really grasping the science means we have to replace our old, broken systems. Because addiction is a brain condition that can affect anyone. We've got to swap out judgment for compassion. We have to replace punishment with proper medical intervention. And we must replace hopelessness with the scientific knowledge that recovery is entirely possible when we use the right tools. If you take anything away from this today, let it be that reaching out for help is a sign of immense strength, and evidence-based treatment genuinely works. As we wrap up, I want to leave you with a provocative question to think about. If the science so clearly proves that addiction is a chronic, physical brain condition shaped by genetics and neurology, why does our society still insist on punishing the symptoms? Thanks for joining me on this deep dive.